I walked in and he had his big tool hanging out. I did not know where to look or how to handle my emotions in that moment. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I did not want to. I walked in further and closed the door behind me. This was a memory I would never forget. Now moving forward to the day my dad had shown me his true feelings for me. Dad kicked my boyfriend Kyle out of the house. His anger wasn't a roaring, explosive kind. It was calm, sharp-edged, and terrifying in its finality. The kind of anger that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you'll never tolerate. It was late, almost midnight, and I was in my bedroom, trying to talk Kyle out of being the reckless, selfish guy I had started to realize he was. He wasn't listening. His voice got louder, sharper. He grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to make his point clear. He didn't like being told he was wrong. Before I could say anything, my bedroom door swung open. "Get your hands off my daughter!" Dad's voice cut through the room like a whip. He was standing there, tall and broad in his flannel shirt and jeans, the way he always looked, like the kind of man you'd never want to disappoint. His blue eyes, so much like mine, were ice cold as they stared at Kyle. Kyle let go of me and tried to say something. I don't even remember what it was. An apology, maybe. An excuse. It didn't matter. "You've got 3 seconds to leave this house," Dad said, "or I'll help you out the door." Kyle didn't wait for the count. He grabbed his jacket and slinked past Dad like a dog with its tail between its legs. As soon as the door slammed shut, Dad turned to me. His face softened instantly, worry replacing the anger. "You okay, kiddo?" That's what he always called me. Kiddo. Like I was still the little girl who needed him to help with homework or patch up a scraped knee. And in some ways, I was. Even at 22, with a college degree and a job, I still needed my dad more than I cared to admit. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm okay." But I wasn't. Not really. And he knew it. He walked over and sat on the edge of my bed, looking at me like I was the most important thing in the world. And to him, I was. "You don't have to deal with guys like that, Beth," he said softly. "You deserve better." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I know." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, the way he always did when I was upset. "Good. Don't forget it." My name is Bethany Carter. I'm 25 now, and everything I am, everything good in me, I owe to my dad. It was just the two of us for as long as I can remember. My mom died when I was 6 years old, and while I've heard people say that kids can't really understand grief, I understood enough to know she was gone and she wasn't coming back. I also understood that Dad's hugs were the only thing in the world that made it hurt a little less. He never let me feel the emptiness of losing her for too long. Not because he tried to replace her. No one could ever do that. But because he stepped up in ways that even I, as a kid, knew weren't easy. He worked long hours as a mechanic to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. And when he wasn't working, he was with me, helping me with school projects, teaching me how to ride a bike, or just sitting with me on the couch while we watched old cartoons. Dad never remarried. People would always ask him why. A man in his 30s with kind eyes and strong hands shouldn't have trouble finding someone. But he'd just shrug and say, "Beth's enough for me." And he meant it. I could see it in the way he smiled at me like I was his whole world. Because I was. And he was mine. Dad and I had our routines, the kind of things that tethered us to each other even when life got hard. Saturdays were our thing. We'd start the morning with pancakes, always topped with too much syrup, because Dad had a sweet tooth and I'd inherited it. Then we'd spend the day doing something we both loved, like working on his old Mustang in the garage. I wasn't a car enthusiast, not really, but there was something about watching Dad work that fascinated me. He'd explain things in a way that made engines seem like magic. "This here," he'd say, holding up a greasy part I couldn't name, "is what keeps it all running smooth. Without it, nothing works." Sometimes I'd pretend to understand. Other times I'd ask questions just to keep him talking. He loved talking about cars, and I loved seeing the way his face lit up when he did. On quieter weekends, we'd watch old westerns. Dad had a soft spot for John Wayne, and I could never sit through a movie without doing an exaggerated cowboy drawl just to make him laugh. It always worked. But no matter what we did, it always felt like home. Safe, warm, just the two of us against the world. Until I started dating. The first time I brought a guy home, I thought Dad was going to have a coronary. I'd met Aaron in my sophomore year of college. He was tall and lanky, with an easy smile and a confidence that I found charming at first. Dad didn't. Not even a little. Aaron had come over for dinner one Friday night. I'd spent the entire day cleaning the house, fussing over the table, and trying to decide whether lasagna would make a better impression than tacos. When Aaron finally arrived, I was so nervous I could barely string 2 sentences together. But Dad was calm. Too calm. He shook Aaron's hand the way he always did when he met someone new. Firm, direct, but with a look in his eye that said, "I'm watching you." Aaron either didn't notice or didn't care, because he spent the entire meal trying to charm Dad. He talked about his future plans, his classes, even his part-time job at a tech company. I thought he was doing well until he made the mistake of putting his arm around me. Dad's face didn't change, not outwardly, but I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way he suddenly became very interested in cutting his steak. When Aaron left that night, I asked Dad what he thought of him. "He seems nice," Dad said. I should have known better. Nice was his code for, "I don't trust him." "Dad, come on, be honest." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "I just don't like the idea of you getting hurt, Beth. That's all." "I'm not going to get hurt," I said, rolling my eyes. "You don't have to scare off every guy I like." "I didn't scare him off," Dad said, leaning back in his chair. "But if he messes up, I'll be ready." I laughed at the time, but there was no mistaking the truth in his voice. He meant it. Dad wasn't the overbearing, controlling type. He just had a way of seeing through people. And whether I wanted to admit it or not, he was usually right. Aaron didn't last long, of course. Looking back, I think I stayed with him longer than I should have just to prove Dad wrong. But when Aaron showed his true colors, flaking on dates, lying about little things, I couldn't ignore the little voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my dad's. "You deserve better." I broke up with Aaron a few months later. Dad didn't say "I told you so," though I could tell he wanted to. Instead, he hugged me and said, "There's nothing wrong with expecting more, kiddo." Every time I brought a guy home after that, Dad would give me the same look. He'd shake their hand, listen politely, and then quietly analyze everything about them over dinner. I never got the impression he wanted to be difficult. He just wanted me to be happy. He wanted to make sure whoever I chose to let into my life was someone who deserved to be there. It wasn't until much later, years after I moved out and started my own life, that I realized how much of his concern came from love. The kind of love that made him fiercely protective, sometimes to a fault. Because to him, I wasn't just his daughter, I was his world. And he didn't trust the world not to break me. But back then, in my early 20s, I was stubborn. I wanted to prove that I could handle myself, even if it meant brushing off his advice or bringing home someone I knew he wouldn't like. Part of me was testing him, I think, to see how far his protectiveness would go. And as much as I hated to admit it, I found comfort in knowing it had no limits. Dad would always be there, no matter what. There was one time when I was about 19. I had just come home from college for the weekend, and Dad and I decided to go to the diner where we used to eat when I was a kid. It was one of those places that hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same red vinyl booths, the same jingle on the jukebox, even the same waitress who'd served us a million times before. We were laughing over something silly, probably one of my professors and his bizarre teaching methods, when the waitress approached with a pot of coffee. "You two make such a cute couple," she said, pouring Dad's cup. The comment hit me like a punch to the stomach. Dad's face froze for a split second before he let out a polite laugh and said, "Oh no, she's my daughter." The waitress looked mortified, mumbling apologies before scurrying off to another table. But the awkwardness lingered. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling her comment had left behind. It wasn't the first time someone had mistaken our relationship. We were close, maybe closer than most fathers and daughters, and sometimes people didn't know how to place that. I guess we should have sat farther apart, I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Dad glanced at me, one hand on the wheel, his brow furrowed in thought. People don't get it, Beth. They don't understand what it's like, just you and me against the world. That's all they're seeing. I know, I said. And I did. But it still stung. As I got older, our closeness sometimes made it harder for me to build other relationships. I relied on Dad for advice, for comfort, for a sense of stability that no one else could provide. When I started dating more seriously, I found myself comparing every guy to him, measuring them against the impossible standard of someone who had devoted his life to protecting me. It wasn't fair, to them or to me. But I didn't know how to stop. There was one night, a few years after the Aaron fiasco, when I found myself leaning on Dad a little too much. I'd just had a terrible breakup. The kind where you question every decision you've ever made, and I showed up at Dad's house with a bottle of wine and tears streaming down my face. He let me in without a word, wrapping me in a hug that felt like home. We sat on the couch, drinking and talking late into the night. I told him everything, spilling my heartbreak and frustration in a way I couldn't with anyone else. "You're too good for guys like him, Beth," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You deserve someone who looks at you the way your mom used to look at me." I smiled through my tears, grateful for his unwavering support. But as the night went on and the wine bottle emptied, I felt the weight of how much I depended on him. It wasn't just about this breakup. It was about every time I'd run to him instead of figuring things out on my own. "You can't always be my safety net," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He looked at me for a long moment, his blue eyes, so much like mine, filled with understanding. "I know, but I'll always be here if you need me." That was the thing about Dad. He loved me unconditionally, but he also knew when to step back. He never let our closeness become a crutch, even when I leaned too hard. He'd remind me, gently but firmly, that I was strong enough to stand on my own. There were other moments, fleeting but intense, when our bond felt almost too much, like the time we danced at my cousin's wedding, and I caught someone whispering, "She's a little too attached to her dad, isn't she?" Or the time I fell asleep on the couch during a movie marathon, my head resting on his shoulder, and a friend teased me about being Daddy's little girl. Each time, Dad and I would brush it off with a laugh, but deep down, we both felt the weight of those comments. They didn't understand what we'd been through, how our closeness wasn't a choice but a necessity, forged in the fire of loss and love. In those moments, we knew we had to be careful. Careful not to let the world's misunderstandings shape our relationship, but also careful not to let our reliance on each other hold us back. It was a delicate balance, one we both worked hard to maintain. As I look back now, I see how those moments shaped us. They taught us the importance of boundaries, of allowing space for growth while still holding on to the bond that had carried us through so much. Dad and I were close, maybe closer than most. But we never let that closeness cross into something it shouldn't be. Because at the heart of it all was a love that was pure, unwavering, and deeply rooted in respect. He was my dad, my anchor, my everything. And that was enough. The years had a way of slipping by when you weren't watching. Before I knew it, I was 25, living in my own apartment downtown, and working as a graphic designer for a small but ambitious startup. Life was moving forward, and so was I, or at least, that's what I told myself. Dad and I still talked almost every day. We'd grab lunch on weekends or catch a game together when our schedules allowed. The closeness was still there, a comforting thread that connected us no matter how much time passed. But something had shifted. Maybe it was me finally wanting to step out of the shadow of our tight-knit world, or maybe it was meeting Liam. I met Liam at a coffee shop. Cliché, I know, but sometimes life hands you happiness in the most ordinary of places. He was sitting at the table next to mine, typing furiously on his laptop, a look of intense concentration on his face. I glanced over, curious about what had him so engrossed, and our eyes met. "Deadlines," he said, grinning sheepishly. "They wait for no one." I laughed. "Tell me about it." That simple exchange turned into a 2-hour conversation. We talked about everything: our jobs, favorite books, the best pizza places in the city. He was easy to talk to, his green eyes warm and inviting, his laugh genuine. For the first time in a long while, I felt a connection with someone that wasn't weighed down by expectations or comparisons. Over the next few weeks, Liam and I grew closer. We went on dates that felt effortless, spent afternoons wandering through art galleries, and shared stories about our lives. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone else, telling him about Mom, about Dad, about the unique bubble of our family. He listened without judgment, his hand wrapped around mine, his thumb tracing circles on my skin. "Your dad sounds like an incredible man," he said one evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset. "He is," I agreed, a mix of pride and apprehension swirling in my chest. "Think he'd be up for meeting me?" Liam asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. The question hung in the air between us. I knew this moment would come, but I hadn't expected it to make my heart race the way it did. I'd like that," I said finally. "But I should warn you, he's protective." Liam smiled. I can handle protective. Telling Dad about Liam was another hurdle. We were sitting in his kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the room. Dad was flipping through the newspaper. Yes, the actual paper kind. And I was trying to find the right words. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," I said, my voice betraying the nerves I felt. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine over the rim of his reading glasses. "Oh?" "His name is Liam. We've been seeing each other for a couple of months." Dad set the newspaper aside, giving me his full attention. "You seem serious about him." "I am," I admitted. "He's different." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, something between concern and resignation. "Well, if he's important to you, I'd like to meet him." "Really?" I hadn't expected him to agree so readily. "Of course, Beth. I trust your judgment." His words should have reassured me, but instead, they left me feeling unsettled. There was an unspoken tension, a quiet understanding that this was more than just introducing a boyfriend. It was me taking a step further away from the world we'd built together. The day Liam was set to come over, I was a bundle of nerves. I arrived at Dad's house early to help with dinner, or at least that was my excuse. In reality, I needed the extra time to gauge his mood, to prepare both of us for what was coming. Dad was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with practiced ease. "You didn't have to come early," he said when I walked in. "I wanted to help," I replied, grabbing an apron. We worked side by side in comfortable silence for a while. The familiar rhythm of cooking together calmed me, but only slightly. "He's a good guy," I said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Dad paused, the knife hovering over a bell pepper. "I'm sure he is." "Just give him a chance." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "Beth, you don't need to convince me. If you care about him, that's enough for me." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach remained. When the doorbell rang, I felt my heart leap into my throat. Dad wiped his hands on a towel and gestured for me to answer it. "Go on," he said gently. I opened the door to find Liam standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in the other. "For you," he said, handing me the flowers, and then added, "And for your dad," lifting the wine. "Thank you," I whispered, touched by the gesture. I led him into the living room where Dad was waiting. "Dad, this is Liam. Liam, this is my father, Michael." Liam extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir." Dad shook his hand firmly. "Liam, I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," Liam replied with a nervous chuckle. Dad gave a small smile. "Well, that remains to be seen." I shot Dad a warning glance, but he merely raised an eyebrow, the hint of a tease in his expression. Dinner started off smoothly enough. The conversation was polite, if a bit stilted. Liam talked about his work as a freelance writer, his love for travel, his family back home. Dad listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that bordered on interrogation but never quite crossing the line. Beth tells me you grew up in Oregon, Dad said, refilling Liam's glass. Yes, in a small town near the coast. Moved here for college and decided to stay. What brought you into writing? Liam smiled. I've always loved stories. There's something powerful about connecting with people through words. Dad nodded thoughtfully. I can respect that. I began to relax, thinking maybe this would go better than expected. But then the conversation took a turn. So Liam, Dad began, his tone shifting slightly. What are your intentions with my daughter? Dad, I exclaimed, my cheeks burning. It's okay, Liam said, placing his hand over mine on the table. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Carter. Michael, Dad corrected. Michael, Liam amended. He took a deep breath. I care about Bethany very much. She's an incredible woman. Smart, talented, compassionate. My intentions are to be with her, to support her, and to see where this relationship takes us. Dad studied him for a long moment. The silence was deafening. I could feel the tension building, each second stretching into an eternity. Fair enough, Dad said finally. But understand this. I only want what's best for her. She's been through a lot, and I won't stand by if someone intends to cause her harm. I would never hurt her, Liam replied earnestly. I promise you that. Promises. I'd heard them before, seen them broken. I looked between the two men, the two pillars in my life, and felt a swell of emotion I wasn't prepared for. Dad, please, I said softly. I need you to trust me. He turned his gaze to me, and I saw the vulnerability there, the fear of losing the one constant he'd held on to. I do trust you, Beth. It's the world I don't trust. I reached across the table, taking his hand. I know, but I have to live in it. I have to make my own choices. His eyes glistened for a moment before he blinked the emotion away. You're right. I'm sorry. Liam watched the exchange quietly, understanding the gravity of the moment without needing an explanation. After dinner, Liam offered to help with the dishes, but Dad waved him off. I've got it. You two go ahead. I led Liam to the backyard, where the night air was cool and the stars peeked through the canopy of trees. We sat on the old swing set Dad had built years ago, the wood creaking softly beneath us. That went better than expected, Liam said, bumping his shoulder gently against mine. I laughed softly. You handled yourself well. He's a good man, Liam said. I can see where you get it from. Get what? Your strength, your loyalty. I looked down, kicking at a loose pebble with my shoe. It's complicated. He tilted his head, studying me. You don't have to explain. I just want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you need. Emotion welled up inside me, a mixture of gratitude and fear. Thank you, I whispered. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You don't have to carry everything on your own, Beth. I leaned into his touch, allowing myself a moment of vulnerability. It's hard to let people in. I know, he said softly, but I'm not going anywhere. Ed. When Liam left that night, he shook Dad's hand at the door. Thank you for having me over. Anytime, Dad replied. There was a hint of warmth in his voice, a subtle acceptance. As I walked Liam to his car, he pulled me into a hug. See you tomorrow? Definitely. I watched as he drove away, a sense of calm settling over me. When I went back inside, Dad was sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across his face. He's a good guy, he said without looking up. Yeah, he is. Silence enveloped us, heavy with unspoken words. I'm proud of you, Dad said finally. Why? For finding someone who makes you happy, for being brave enough to let him in. I sat down beside him. It's not easy. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I know I've been overprotective. Dad. Let me finish, he said gently. After your mom died, I didn't know how to be anything but everything for you. It's been just us for so long, and I guess I forgot that you'd need more than that someday. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. You'll always be my dad. Nothing changes that. He smiled, a sad sort of smile. But things do change, Beth, and that's okay. It's how it's supposed to be. I rested my head on his shoulder, just like I used to when I was a little girl. I don't want to lose what we have. You won't, he assured me. It'll just grow, make room for more. We sat there for a while, the weight of the moment settling around us. It was a turning point, an unspoken agreement to let each other move forward without letting go. Over the next few weeks, Dad and Liam began to form their own relationship. They'd talk about sports, share book recommendations, even make plans to grab a beer without me. It was strange at first, watching them interact independently of me, but it also filled me with a warmth I hadn't expected. One afternoon, I came over to find them in the garage, tinkering with Dad's old Mustang. They were laughing about something, grease smudged on their hands. Am I interrupting? I called out, leaning against the doorway. Just in time, Liam said, wiping his hands on a rag. Your dad was just telling me about the time you tried to repaint this car as a surprise. I groaned. He promised never to speak of that again. Dad chuckled. Some promises are meant to be broken. I rolled my eyes but couldn't hide my smile. That evening, after Liam had left, Dad and I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. He's good for you, Dad said, breaking the comfortable silence. I think so too. He took a deep breath. You know, when your mom and I first started dating, her father didn't approve of me. Really? He nodded. Thought I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't provide for her. How did you handle it? He smiled wistfully. I loved her. That was enough. Eventually he came around. I reached over and squeezed his hand. Thank you for giving Liam a chance. He squeezed back. Thank you for pushing me to grow. We sat there, the air filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant hum of the neighborhood. It was peaceful, a moment of contentment that I wanted to hold on to. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still moments of tension, times when Dad's protectiveness flared up, or when I struggled to balance the two most important relationships in my life. But we were learning, all of us, how to navigate this new terrain. One night, as I was leaving Dad's house, he hugged me tightly. I'm always here for you, kiddo. I know, I said, hugging him back just as fiercely. And I'm here for you too. As I drove away, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead was uncertain, full of possibilities and challenges, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. I had the love of a good man and the unwavering support of my dad. And maybe that was more than anyone could ask for. The raw emotions of fear, love, and acceptance had woven themselves into our lives, creating a tapestry of experiences that shaped who we were. Dad had let go just enough to allow me to find my own way, and in doing so, we'd both grown. I realized that love wasn't about holding on tightly, but about trusting enough to let go. It was about making room for others without losing the connection that meant the most. As I stood on the cusp of a new chapter, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together, just like we always had. A few months later, Liam and I decided to take the next step. He hadn't officially moved in yet, but his toothbrush was in my bathroom, his clothes mingled with mine in the closet, and his presence had become as natural as breathing. We were building something real, something lasting, and it felt right. Still, there was one thing Liam hadn't done yet. Have you asked him? I asked one Saturday morning as we lounged on the couch, his arm draped around my shoulders. Asked who what, he replied, feigning innocence. Liam, I said, sitting up to face him. You know exactly what I mean. My dad. Have you talked to him? Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want to. I've just been waiting for the right time. I smiled, placing a hand on his cheek. There's no such thing as the right time. Just do it. He nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. You're right. I'll call him. The next weekend, Liam showed up at Dad's house without me. I stayed home, pacing the apartment, wringing my hands as the minutes turned into hours. I'd told Liam he didn't need my blessing, that he and Dad could handle this on their own, but that didn't stop me from worrying. When Liam finally texted me, it was simple. It went well. Be home soon. Later that evening, I met Dad for dinner. I couldn't stop myself from asking. So, I began, poking at my salad with my fork, what did you think? About what? Dad replied, though his slight smile betrayed him. Dad. He set his fork down and folded his hands on the table. He came by and asked for my blessing. And? Dad leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. And I gave it to him. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. You really like him, don't you? I do, Dad said simply. He's a good man, Beth. He reminds me of myself in some ways. I laughed. He's nothing like you. Oh, he's got his differences, Dad admitted. But his heart's in the right place. He loves you, and that's all I've ever wanted for you. Tears welled in my eyes. Thank you, Dad. He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. You don't need to thank me, kiddo. Just promise me one thing. Anything. Be happy. I will, I said, my voice breaking with emotion. I am. The following spring, Liam proposed. It was simple, intimate. Just the two of us on a quiet evening in the park where we'd had our first date. He didn't need grand gestures or a big audience. His words were enough. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Bethany Carter, he said, kneeling in front of me. I don't want to go through life without you. Will you marry me? Yes, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. 1,000 times yes. Planning the wedding was a whirlwind of excitement and chaos. But through it all, Dad was my rock. He helped me choose the perfect venue, sampled far too many cake flavors, and even gave his opinion on flower arrangements when I couldn't decide between roses and lilies. We went with roses, classic and strong, he'd said. But the moment that stuck with me most was when we danced at the reception. The DJ announced the father-daughter dance, and Dad held out his hand, a rare hint of nerves flickering in his eyes. We swayed to the music, the room fading away as I looked up at him. You did good, Dad, I said softly. He chuckled. You're the one getting married, not me. You know what I mean. You raised me. You taught me what love looks like. His voice cracked as he said, You make it easy to be proud, Beth. Tears slipped down my cheeks, but I didn't care. I love you, Dad. I love you too, kiddo. Life moved on after that, as it always does. Liam and I started our life together, building a home filled with love and laughter. Dad visited often, sometimes to help fix something, sometimes just to spend time with us. He and Liam had formed their own bond, one that made me smile every time I saw them chatting in the kitchen or watching a game together. But no matter how much my life changed, my relationship with Dad remained a constant. He was my anchor, my guiding star, the person who had shaped me into the woman I'd become. And though I no longer needed him to be my whole world, I knew he would always be the foundation of it. Because that's what love does. It grows, it changes, but it never truly fades. It just makes room for more. And in the end, that's all any of us can ask for.